The old rabbis said that Abraham was the first person God had spoken to since Noah. It had been about 350 years since the ark was built. It had been about 350 years since anybody had heard from God. It's not hard to imagine what the world was like without God in it. A wasteland of suffering where the birds never sang, but only wept from the fallen trees. But what was God doing all that time? What was happening in heaven? That's harder to imagine. I think God was mourning. Almost all of life on earth had been washed away in the floodwaters. The loss God had suffered was truly staggering. So I imagine that God had turned away so that the world would not be drowned all over again, drowned this time with his tears. God had been grieving. And when at long last he dried his eyes and looked down through the dark clouds that for centuries had hung over the world like a shroud, when he could finally see through the fog of his sorrow, the first thing he saw was someone else with bloodshot eyes, someone else dressed all in black. He saw Abraham, who was mourning the death of his own father. The last verse of the 11th chapter of Genesis, the verse right before this morning's reading, says, "And Abraham's father died in Haran." Maybe Abraham had cried so loudly that God couldn't not hear him. Maybe Abraham had heaved with sorrow so mightily that it shook God out of his own grief. The story doesn't say why God went to the one he did and went to him when he did. But I think God, a father who had buried so many daughters, I think God, a father who had buried so many sons, was drawn to this son who had buried his father. I think God knew what it was to grieve alone and didn't want Abraham to suffer as he had. I think God wanted to spare Abraham that double portion of pain, the loneliness added to the loss. And I think even still, wherever a son stands at the grave of his father, God stands beside him there. Wherever a daughter sits with an old photo album open in her lap and remembers her father and misses her father, God sits beside her there. God said to Abraham, "Go from your country, go from your kindred, go from your father's house." Of all the things God could have said to him, like "I'm sorry for your loss," or "Your father was a good man." Of all the things God could have said to him, why did God say this? Had Abraham's grief become something other than grief? Had it become a sort of black hole sucking all the light in the night sky into it? A darkness so deep it threatened to swallow him whole? Had a part of Abraham died when his father died? Was God calling him now to put one foot in front of the other and begin that long climb out of the valley of the shadow of death? Was God summoning him back to the land of the living? God would not have let death be the end of him any more than God will let death be the end of us. Or maybe Abraham's grief was not so much a crushing grief as it was a complicated grief. Maybe, who knows, maybe home had not always been a happy place for him. And maybe God was freeing Abraham from his father's house. Some of us spend our whole lives trying to free ourselves from our father's house. And maybe God was freeing Abraham from his father's love, which had never felt to him like a father's love. Maybe God was freeing him for a love less wounding. Maybe Abraham had to do what many of us have also had to do: grieve someone who hurt us, grieve someone who we had to get away from. Maybe God came to Abraham as the father he'd never had. Or maybe, who knows, maybe it wasn't that either. Maybe it was something else entirely. The Hebrew phrase that we read in English as simply go, it means more than go. Another way to translate it is go to yourself. Go to yourself. So maybe in telling him to leave his father's house, to leave his family behind, maybe God was telling Abraham to leave the expectations his father and his family had for him behind. Maybe God was telling Abraham to leave who his father and his family saw him as behind. Maybe God meant for Abraham to leave all the old patterns and all the old pressures and all the old pain that had made him someone other than who God had made him. Maybe God had meant for him to leave all that behind and go out and be a truer self. Maybe God stood at the open door beckoning to him, as God beckons to us when we can no longer be who our fathers and who our families want us to be and need to set out on our own. Although, again, who knows, it might not have been as simple as that. Because before he died, Abraham's father had left his own homeland. He had set out dreaming of Canaan, of settling there. But he never made it to that land flowing with milk and honey. He died on the far side of the River Jordan. So maybe God was calling Abraham to finish what his father had started. Maybe God was calling Abraham to walk the last leg of his journey. Maybe for Abraham, and maybe for us too, we can spend our whole lives leaving our father's house only to end up right back where we started. Maybe no matter how far we wander, we are always only finding our way home. Maybe the truer selves we're growing into may turn out in the end to bear a striking resemblance to the fathers we thought we'd left behind. But God did not only step into the space between Abraham and his father and make that a holy place. God still does this, whether it is marked by grief or anger or gratitude. The space between us and our fathers, or between us and our fathers' memories, it's a space God still moves within. But God stood then, as God still stands, in two places at once. God also stepped into the space between Abraham and the sons he didn't yet have. God stood in that field of longing and left a blessing. Abraham would dream of becoming a father, would dream of this for many, many years before his children finally were born. And God was there, dreaming with him. All of the hope and the heartbreak, which of course were not the same hope and heartbreak his wife had known in her body, but which were hope and heartbreak even so. God was there through it all. Not every man's story is Abraham's story. Sometimes the way God blesses the longing to be a father is to quietly deepen it and change it to a different kind of longing, to be a father in another way entirely, in a way we'd never have imagined. But however our longings are fulfilled, God is also there when inevitably we don't quite live up to them. When Abraham went on and made mistakes, sometimes terrible mistakes, when he failed to be the father he thought he would be, when he struggled to forgive himself, when his son struggled to forgive him, God was there to forgive him, to heal him of the guilt he felt, to free him, and to guide him. The Father above did not leave Abraham to father alone. There is always a love that reaches us in our loving, and there is always a love that reaches us in our failing to love as we ought. The story of this father and of every father, of this son and every son, and of every mother and daughter too, is the story of God at work. Thanks be to God. In gratitude, let us give.